Let me extend my a note of gratitude, appreciation to the U.S.-China Institute and to the university for the opportunity to be here this afternoon and talk with you about one of my very favorite subjects, and that is the relationship between the United States and China, U.S. foreign policy toward China, Chinese foreign policy, and its changing role in the world and how it's affecting decision-making within China today. I think it's a timely opportunity to discuss what has been in many of the newspapers and other media, which suggest that China is becoming a increasingly assertive. We hear that word a lot. That China is flexing its muscles, not being as prepared perhaps, as in the past, to be cooperative. I don't put a lot of stock in some of these interpretations, and I think in some ways we can explain our perception of Chinese assertiveness, so-called, by looking at ourselves and understanding weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and problems of our own in the United States and elsewhere in the Western world, which could well be a stronger explanatory variable for why we think China's being assertive today. So this is not going to be about whether China is or isn't being assertive. I'm trying to present something I hope is a little bit more nuanced and will hopefully shed a little bit more light upon internal decision-making in China. It's important, I think, that we do so. The mood across the world, and particularly in the United States and in Europe, toward China is definitely souring, taking a downturn. Surveys in the United States and across Europe show downward favorability ratings for China from their peaks in the early to mid-2000s. And of course, beyond perceptions, China's economic competitiveness, the claim that its currency is not overvalued, China's ongoing military modernization effort, and Beijing's continued insistence to define human rights on its own terms all contribute to this trend in the West. And more recently, I think disturbingly, China is increasingly viewed in some parts of the West as part of the problem in dealing with global challenges such as climate change or stemming the nuclear ambitions of countries like Iran and North Korea, dealing with certain regional instabilities, or righting global financial and economic imbalances. And with global threats becoming more complex, expectations in the West are greater than ever that a stronger and more prosperous China can and should do more to address them. But can China? Will China? And I think from the viewpoint of China's leaders today, the answer to both of these questions is not yet. And in that regard, I suspect that more disappointments will lie ahead for us in our relations with China. Not only will expectations of China continue to grow, but China's willingness and ability to meet them will continue to lag. And what we have in front of us then is something I've called an expectations gap, a widening expectations gap, which is going to define a more difficult period in the short term, maybe even a little bit, say, next 3 to 5 years, a more difficult period ahead for China's relations with the outside world, and especially, I suspect, with the United States and other Western countries. On the Chinese side, then, and trying to look at what might explain this phenomenon, I see a number of long-standing and somewhat stubborn structural impediments which are going to hinder the emergence of positions which the United States and others in the West would find constructive on the part of China. I'm just going to talk about 5 of them here and then close with some thoughts about what we can do about it. First, an even more active role for China on the world stage has long been constrained by its nearly unassailable maxims, which call for the country to eschew leadership and skirt controversial decisions in international affairs. Most often cited in this regard is Deng Xiaoping's well-known 24-character strategy of the early 1990s, which continues to hold sway today. Its precise English translation is a matter of debate among Western specialists, but the overall threat of Deng's admonition to Chinese leaders is to avoid taking the lead in the international stage, keeping a low profile, steering clear of trouble, and quietly focusing on China's own capabilities and in particular its own domestic challenges. In short, Deng recognized that China needs a stable and peaceful external environment in order to focus on modernization at home. This statement was later modified and abbreviated to an even better known 8-character slogan, which today remains a widely used guideline for internal party and internal governmental deliberations. Tao Guangyang Hui, You Suo Zuo Wei, which has been translated as keep a low profile and bide our time, while also making some contributions. Deng is also widely quoted in language which remains powerful in the deliberations internally, that, quote, even if in the future China is well developed and a strong nation, never seeks spheres of influence, never takes sides with factions in world politics, never seek interference in the internal affairs of other states. And while these strategic guidelines are surely debated and are very a subject of great interest and discussion in China, and some adjustments can be made to them, I would posit that they continue to serve as quite potent principles which will place constraints upon China's willingness and ability to be more proactive and to take positions which in the West we would find constructive and more convergent with not only our interests but world interests as well. So that's point 1. Sort of the power of these strategic and longstanding principles to constrain Chinese action on the foreign policy stage. Second, China's willingness and ability to take part in bolder action on the international stage, either by itself or multilaterally with others, will continue to be limited by what are correctly the pressing priorities of the country's internal and developmental problems, as well as the inherent insecurity the leadership in China feels as it struggles to maintain China's high-speed trajectory on course without losing control. It may seem strange to say this, but in many important respects, we could argue that China is really not a stable country if we broaden our understanding of what we mean by that. As you all know, China is phenomenally dynamic, rapidly transforming, and always within a steady boil of social and political unrest. This is what characterizes much of China's domestic situation. At the same time, we recognize that nationalism is on the rise in China, with more and more netizens and elites calling on their leaders to be more assertive, there's that word, in leveraging the country's economic might towards securing Chinese interests and regaining China's rightful place among the world's most powerful nations. I suspect that Chinese leaders are deeply concerned and even insecure with a potential nationalistic monster that they have had a hand in creating. On the one hand, the Communist Party continuously reminds Chinese of the humiliation the nation suffered at the hands of outsiders in the 19th and early 20th centuries, emphasizing the need to always be vigilant against hostile outside forces that might seek to undermine and even tear apart the Chinese nation. And on the other hand, citizens are constantly reminded that they have the party to thank for lifting China to the top of the world, and that the party will never again allow China to be disgraced. This narrative, in a sense, has meant that the Chinese leadership have become captive to their own success. The combination then of remarkable economic growth, China's integration with a globalizing world, and the citizenry's increasing demands make China a formidably complex country to govern. The leadership fears that if citizens' demands are left unchecked, it could lead to greater instabilities and a further loss of centralized social political control, and ultimately, maybe, the demise of the Communist Party. I think that helps explain some of the tougher crackdowns we see in places like Tibet and Xinjiang, the reactions to the Dalai Lama's high-profile visitations around the world, stricter limits on the internet and social networking sites, and stiffer penalties for persons deemed dangerous to social and political order. This is not to say that China is on the verge of crumbling into chaos, but I think we all understand that the centrifugal forces in China today are strong, and Beijing's leaders will focus overwhelmingly on trying to maintain the domestic house in order. And that just means that there is going to be less time, less interest, and fewer allocation of resources in actively engaging the outside world at the levels which key international partners would like to see. The priorities at home are simply too important. Moreover, foreign policy choices, and we can maybe point to some and discuss some of these choices in the Q&A, are going to be more and more shaped then by how they impact these questions of domestic stability, further limiting Beijing's willingness to compromise and cut deals with the outside world. So that's the second point, that internal priorities limit Beijing's willingness to be more proactive externally. Third, under these conditions, and as the country enters an important succession competition for the handover to the fifth generation of Chinese leaders in 2012, it is possible, though I'll admit at this point difficult to assess clearly, but it's possible to suggest that current and future leaders will want to avoid looking soft toward foreigners. Anecdotal evidence, discussions with friends, even quite senior people in China suggest quite strongly, actually, that they themselves feel constrained in what they can say publicly with regard to foreign policy choices, that they risk being pilloried by Chinese netizens who want to see a much more tougher and a narrowly self-interested foreign policy line. I think this is hard to assess to the degree to which this looking tough is really driving choices at the senior-most leadership of China. But I think it's fair to say that this phenomenon weighs on the minds of important people in China today. And what it means is leaders, advisors, may be more reluctant today to be concessionary and will feel the need to flex China's power from time to time in the name of more narrowly defined Chinese national interests. But we can discuss this, whether this is a well-founded a factor, but I think it's worth looking at more carefully. Fourthly, China is also constrained by the very nature of its political system and its governmental structure, its decision-making processes. As far as I can see, major decisions in China, and especially somewhat controversial ones and ones which involve foreign policy decision-making, are taken through a deliberative and measured consensus-building process, which, once reached, is difficult to change. Deborah Seligson, who was formerly the attaché for environmental issues in China for the United States and who's now a Beijing-based advisor for the World Resources Institute, she noted in a recent publication that Chinese leaders are not really politicians, at least not in the same way that their counterparts in Western countries are politicians, or for that matter, their counterparts in countries like India, Brazil, or South Africa. Chinese leaders are bureaucrats, and they are unaccustomed to on-the-fly deal-making or crafting breakthroughs face-to-face with world leaders over the heads of their staffers. Think about the hurly-burly of politics through which a guy like Barack Obama has reached the White House. This is a world in which you give and take and compromise on the fly and find the deal. That's not how decisions made, and certainly not decisions about controversial and difficult and sensitive issues concerning foreigners are taken. And I think what happened in Copenhagen, sort of the inflexibility of the Chinese at the end of the day, is suggestive of this problem. And again, that's going to limit China's ability to be more proactive on the international stage. We could add to this business of governance and the nature of decision-making in China today as being a limiting factor. Important decisions in the country are increasingly affected by a growing number of more powerful stakeholders, which makes consensus building, the difficult process of consensus building, all the more hard to achieve, but at the same time, all the more fragile, and hence less open to adjustment by top leaders for the sake of strategic compromise with outsiders. The interests of government commissions, ministries, major financial and investment institutions, state-owned conglomerates, municipal and provincial locales must be all taken into account. All of this adds up to make China appear often, to Western eyes, as less than flexible and even unreliable in the face of growing global challenges on which China is called to play a more and more active and constructive role. And then finally, fifthly, structural challenges for China going forward in dealing with the outside world. I think it's fair to say that China is still inept, still unskilled at deflecting the accruing damage which is mounting to its international image, which further affects then its ability and willingness to actively address global challenges with international partners. Beijing is only just beginning to realize the value of public diplomacy outside of China, crafting messages for foreign public and media consumption, and being prepared for a flexible, well-tuned response as circumstances shift. In short, Beijing has a major PR, public relations problem. A part of this derives from the fact that China is a one-party state that does not tolerate dissent. Chinese leaders and government officials do not face harsh public criticism at home. And when they anticipate widespread disillusionment or antagonism, they have levers and measures which can be taken to suppress it rather than engage it or try to debate it. It also reflects, I would say, a general unease and unfamiliarity with the role and tactics of active, independent media and non-governmental advocacy organizations in other countries. Unaccustomed to public criticism and too often choosing to interpret this criticism as an attack on China and even the Chinese people themselves, Chinese spokespersons and other officials too often lash out in indignation, and I would say in rather unproductive ways. This in turn only poisons the atmosphere and again constrains the ability for China to more effectively and actively engage with the international community, further contributing to this expectations gap, which I opened with at the beginning. So these are deep-seated, long-standing problems, impediments, that we as interpreters of Chinese foreign policy, we as persons who I think seek a more productive and effective relationship with China, we need to be more aware of these phenomena and these impediments, and think a little bit more clearly about how we can work with China, work through and around these challenges. Unfortunately, though, I think these proclivities are likely to become more pronounced, not less, in the coming years. These impediments are unlikely to change much in the near term, may even get stronger in the near term, even as expectations of China continue to mount. These constraints mean that Beijing will not readily take the lead. It will not vigorously bring pressure to bear on other states, especially in the developing world. It will not take decisions at the international level which could be interpreted as negatively affecting certain interests of domestic stability and development. This has a lot of implications then for real-world issues that we're grappling with today with China. For example, to meet international expectations that China can make a larger and more constructive contribution to dealing with a range of global and regional challenges. Not only does this mean that the relationship with China is going to continue to be awkward and tense, but it also means, maybe more importantly, that it's going to weaken the ability of the international community, broadly writ, to tackle some of these big challenges, like righting global fiscal imbalances, achieving mitigation of climate change, assuring the development of the global south, addressing proliferation concerns in North Korea, in Iran, and elsewhere, resolving ongoing and looming regional conflicts as in Afghanistan, in Sudan, and averting the fallout from the weakening and even failure in some parts of states in some parts of the world, such as in Yemen, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So this does not bode well for the international community's ability to grapple with these problems, and it doesn't bode well, I would say, for China's relations with the Western world and other partners in the near to medium term. So what can we do? How can we move forward? How can we hope to build a more constructive relationship with China and try to work through the problems that I've suggested we face? Well, first, I think it would be important for us to be much more modest and moderate in our expectations about what kind of partner China is likely to be in this coming period. This does not mean turning our backs on China, certainly not practical, not desirable, but having a more realistic expectation, a more finely tuned set of diplomatic tactics, tools, and strategies to work with Beijing to gain the kinds of limited but nevertheless important forms of cooperation and contributions we'd like to see from China. Obviously, this is going to include a lot more work to demonstrate to the Chinese that it is in their interest to take positions that are more convergent, not just with the United States, but more importantly, with other regional and global stakeholders around a given issue. It's still the case, I think, that China remains uncomfortable as an outlier and wishes to be seen as part of the solution, as long as this is not simply a U.S.-centered solution. That also means investing a lot more time and resources to understanding and interpreting Chinese domestic pressures, Chinese internal politics, and foreign policy decision-making structures. Debates and differing points of view are far more prominent and accessible in China today. I think it would behoove all of us to be much more in tune, attuned, and sensitive to these debates and integrate our analysis and understanding of these debates in our approaches to China as a foreign policy partner. Again, we don't want to turn our back on China, but I think it is the case that we should explore more actively how we can work with other partners in the world, such as in Europe and in Asia, to seek multilateral solutions. Obviously, we should leave the door open to China to participate in various mechanisms, but it shouldn't be a make or break proposition. Turning to China, what could be some steps that China might be able to undertake? I think Chinese leaders and their advisors, strategists, could do more, they need to do more, to assume a confident and responsible leadership role commensurate with its growing role and capabilities and commensurate with the benefits that it surely gains from its integration with the international community. We should hope that Beijing would not allow uncertainties at home to result in a perceived need to be more assertive or to overreach abroad. An important step also would be to build a more positive relationship with foreign media and foreign civil society advocacy organizations, including a more nuanced appreciation for their role and their means of operations. Chinese strategists and leaders would also do well, I think, to gain an even more sophisticated understanding of the domestic political pressures felt by their elected counterparts from democratic countries, and try to be more prepared to be responsive to those domestic politics in their counterparts' countries for the sake of better, longer-term relations. These steps will certainly not be easy. The generation of greater sensibilities on both sides are going to be difficult, and in the end may be impossible to fully realize. Clearly, the work being done at places like the U.S.-China Institute and more broadly here on the campus of the University of Southern California can make a big contribution by training the next generation of leaders who will have to assume an even more important role, I should say, in our relationship with China in the future. But for now, I think we might say that China's charm offensive, as it was called by an author in recent years, may have reached its plateau. Leaders on all sides, I think, will now need to redouble our efforts to more deeply integrate China as an actively constructive partner in addressing the global and regional challenges to stability, prosperity, and sustainability which we jointly face with China in this world. But in the meantime, unfortunately, I think we can expect a difficult road ahead in our relations with China. Thank you very much.